Hello everyone, my name is Mr. Gentleman and we are here to do one thing and one thing only, and that is discuss Final Fantasy III. Note that this analysis is based on the Famicom version of the game, though the remake will be mentioned as we go on. One of the things that fascinates me is how different the Japanese and American fandoms of Final Fantasy can be. While 1 and 2 were successful, that's actually quite relative. For Japan, the breakthrough for Square's marquee franchise was Final Fantasy III. Similarly to how many old-school Western gamers revere Mario Bros. 3 as the greatest Mario title, there are a legion of nostalgic Eastern fans who treat the third Final Fantasy with absolute reverence. While my personal sentiments don't go that far, I do agree that the third game in the series was a seminal moment for series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team. A mysterious earthquake signals a rising evil raging across the world. 4 orphans fall into a pit and discover they are the heroes of light, a motif returning from the first game. The crystal, another echoed motif, using the last of its power grants them special abilities, which allows them to take on a variety of jobs. The game launches us right into the action and gives the player a lot of room to breathe, as it clearly wants to get them into the gameplay and job system. One night, Sakaguchi had an epiphany and came up with a new concept. He immediately called a meeting the next day and explained his new idea. Upon hearing it, the office reacted with, "Oh great, Sakaguchi-san is at it again." While Dragon Quest III defined the modern identity of console RPGs, with unique character building mechanics, Final Fantasy III would make its contributions as well. This is not the first game to allow for class changing, but each title of the time had its own goals and ambitions. Dragon Quest III and Curse of the Azure Bonds were about multi-classing concepts. While I vastly prefer that model and even Final Fantasy would later, it introduced 2 new ideas of its own: the ability to switch classes anywhere, anytime, and being able to constantly unlock more and more classes, up to 20 in total by the end of the game. The idea is that anyone can change their roles and gain levels in them, and advance to better classes. This game really has a lot in common with Final Fantasy I's masterclassing. You are essentially choosing a better and somewhat more specialized version of your class. Your starter job is the basic, low-stat, no-specialty Onion Knight, based on the Japanese idiom the onion life, saying you're peeling away one layer at a time and crying all the way. Essentially, you're poor, you're jobless, and you have no skills. Though they do have a trick up their sleeve. The Wind Crystal grants you the 5 traditional Final Fantasy classes: the physically powerful fighter, the fast, high-strength, high-vitality but low-armor monk, the expected white mage, the expected black mage, and the average red mage, though they now have given him more exclusive equipment. Typically when building a team, you want 2 physical classes and 2 mages, usually 1 a healer. In fact, the game is paced so you find upgrades for physical and mage classes at different points to keep things interesting. The Fire Crystal focuses mostly on physical classes. Knights returning from the first game are the most basic upgrade to the warrior with the same benefits. Brand new is the Cover ability, allowing you to take damage for allies below 25% HP. Thieves have gained a huge strength buff. Their escape ability allows for a guaranteed run, and they can now steal items. Also new is if you put them in front of the party, he can open locked doors without a key. On the mage line, scholars can use elemental books, which I think he's supposed to read but hilariously flails. They have the peep ability to see enemy HP, and scan to detect enemy weak points or examine ally armor. But they have lackluster stats. The Ranger is more of an in-between class, which might be strange to consider, but allow me to explain. He can physically attack well from the back row, using unique bows and elemental arrows, but is not as strong as other physical classes. And he can also learn white magic up to level 3, making him a decent healer, though he may need a little item support. But as a result, he's great for advancing your white mage or red mage if you desire to upgrade them. The water crystal is balanced with 4 physical masterclasses and 3 mage ones. We receive the fan-favorite dragoons who use spears, and can use many armors including the dragon mail. Their famous jump command is a 2-turn move leaving you in the air for one of them, but does high damage. Their strength is great but lower than a Knights and Vikings to balance jump. Vikings are the powerhouses of great strength and vitality. They can use most armors, including the exclusive Viking mail and axes. Their trademark weapon is less accurate, but since this game uses the hit system, it means you'll always get in some damage. And it is worth the gamble to go for those meaty, high-damaging hits. The Black Belt returns being a heightened monk, but now has built up a twice stackable buff that gives 3 times, then 6 times damage. But any damage taken during this time will be a critical hit. They have excellent stats except for only decent defense. The Dark Knight uses dark swords and armor but cannot use anything else, meaning you cannot really use him at first until you find the Dark Knight town. But he's extremely powerful and can use low-level white magic for some reason. Overall stats are evened out, but it's only because he wields such powerful weapons and his speed is extremely high. Geomancers use the power of the earth, though in Japan they are called Fu Sui based on the ancient Chinese pseudoscience to predict the weather known as Feng Shui, in which bells were used, hence the bell weapon. Using the terrain command, depending on what you're standing on, the Geomancer will attack differently. Conjurers are the series' first summoners. Using summon, they will randomly get a white or black effect, the former granting healing, defensive effects, or status afflictions, and the latter damaging the enemy. The Bard, likely a homage to the CRPG A Bard's Tale, attacks with song. Chair increases the party's attack power, functioning like haste, and is stackable, while Scare reduces the enemy's level, making them weaker and even run away. The Earth Crystal focuses on magical masterclasses. The Magus, like the first game's Black Wizard, is the ultimate Black Mage, while the Shaman, akin to the White Wizard, is the ultimate White Mage. The Summoner is to the Conjurer what the last 2 jobs were to their predecessors. They have high speed, low strength and vitality, but they have their own summon attack which is extremely powerful, making it one of the most powerful jobs in the game. And for clearing the Dungeon Eureka, you receive the Ninja, the ultimate physical job, and the Sage, the ultimate magical class. Ninjas can use every weapon and armor in the game, including the absurdly powerful Shuriken, which should be saved for the equally absurd final boss. The Sage can use white, black, and summon abilities with high speed and vitality. To give an example of what a character pathway would look like, you can pause the video and look at what I did for my run of the game. Overall, the class selection works and most jobs function as intended. I appreciate giving the Red Mage some unique equipment, what they did with the Ranger, and how they handled the Thief. Maybe they could have included more balanced jobs since the Red Wizard is not in this game. There is a nice mix of original class ideas not used anywhere else in the world's RPGs, many of which would become iconic. When it comes to combat, the game does a good job at making you feel increasingly powerful when you change your jobs. And while not as difficult as previous titles, it maintains a good challenge. It helps to understand the pros and cons in terms of the hit system, pros and cons between what opposing jobs on the same tier will offer you, what buffs and debuffs will help you, and how the abilities of new jobs provide for new strategies. In the end, the game keeps you on your toes, you have to understand your abilities, and bosses test your plans. On the downside, the Geomancer has a good chance of dealing damage to your own team, making me wonder if Kawazu snuck in and messed with the programming. Scholars are useless due to their attacking abilities and overall stats being so lackluster. The Conjurer's randomness can also be off-putting if you're just trying to get through enemy grunts. The Thief's Steel can also only get you potions and antidotes, but at least he has other uses. And Ninjas and Sages are so pivotal to the end game's difficulty that you must use 2 each, taking away some of the game's trademark variety. Though there is one last extreme option. If you get an Onion Knight to skill level 92 and above, his games become absurdly huge. By skill level 99, he overpowers everything else. They are also the only ones who can equip the Onion Sword and armor pieces, the most overpowered equipment in the game. Final Fantasy II, flawed as its execution was, had a fascinating weapon and ability skill system. This game inherits a simplified skill level system. Along with your normal level, you have job skill levels that will go up faster when you use your job's trademark abilities. Skill levels increase your stats as long as you have that job equipped, and will require less spiritual capacity to switch back to that job. More on that in a moment. I do wish there was a number or bar to indicate your skill level progress like with 2's system, since it's always fun to see numbers go up. This all had an effect on the hit system. Hits were damage multipliers. For every 16 agility you gain an extra physical attack multiplier, and every 16 intellect for magic. Everyone can dual wield, meaning more hits makes shields irrelevant. The hit system and its interaction with stats could change how you play, since you may want to get a skill level of 33 as fast as possible. This kind of statistical number crunching was what people were into back in the day, and some still are. It is what made Japanese players love the game to begin with. While simplified from Final Fantasy II, that game's systems were implemented perhaps in a time before they could be properly realized. So I'm glad we at least have a vestige of what that game had. The only downside is that, like in the last game, because mages are tied up with MP, this system sometimes favors physical classes since they can attack more freely. As alluded to, nothing carries over when you change class except for HP. To prevent you from, say, switching everyone to a high vitality class like a monk right before you level up, an amount of spiritual capacity must be spent when you change jobs. You earn capacity from winning battles, so while you might get away with monk changing a few times, it's not sustainable. The cost to switch classes depends on both if you have skill levels in it and on your current job. If you're a physical class, it generally costs less to switch to another physical class, reinforcing the master class concept. But as long as you're not trying to abuse the points you have, the game gives you enough for experimentation or to correct any mistakes you feel you made along the way. The last thing I want to mention on jobs is a common and erroneous complaint. Some say when you switch to a better class, it's frustrating because you are starting over again. However, the game is balanced in a way that when you gain new classes, their stats at skill level 0 are just about the average area the game expected you to be at. And with a little skill level training, you far outclass your last job quickly. So assuming you didn't overlevel, it works out. Final Fantasy III's job system also presents a strong metaphor. The 4 blank slate orphans are coming of age and have yet to take on any vocation, represented by the fact that they begin with the same stats. But you, the player, are role-playing them through their individual growth and journey into adulthood, symbolized by choosing different job pathways for each of them. The result is a gameplay story synergy that you are allowed to play out. I find this game's job system to be fun and function as intended. It's for the same reason Final Fantasy I's Masterclass moment worked. You got to upgrade, becoming more powerful. It was an exciting moment you felt you earned. Final Fantasy III is that on steroids, with multiple levels of class upgrading, and each time you do it, it's exciting. On top of that, it's fun to plan the pathway your characters will take, from a huge variety of classes. And it feels good to reach those skill levels when you know you finally get that extra hit. This kind of class system is somewhat of a novelty, compared to games like Final Fantasy V, the Bravely games, and later Dragon Quest titles, which all have so much more depth. But it still manages to be a compelling experience. To cover a few other noteworthy concepts, a new feature is how with enemy formations, while you can still go all the way left to cast all, you can hit up to cast on a certain enemy type, which is very efficient when dealing with weaknesses. I'm happy that they brought back the MP charge system. The increased amount of charges allows you to actually enjoy the magic system while the game still challenges you enough. You'll also notice that you won't be getting many buffing spells early on in the game, which is disappointing since you get some very early in the first game. In general, a lot of elements from the previous games return, and I'll simply list those on the screen. One area the game thrives in is in quality of life improvements. I gave Nazir a lot of flack last time, but he does a great job here fixing the series' nagging issues and bugs. However, he somehow managed to have his visa expire again, causing the team to pack up and continue development in Sacramento for a second time. Still, he made the game run at a brisk pace. Of all of his fixes, the most important was dealing with the game's long-standing issue of attacks missing. If you targeted an enemy and they died. The completed game is a pretty sizable adventure, and Nazir made it work, programming onto a 512 KIB cart, the second highest capacity available. Overall, it was a job well done for the last Final Fantasy game he would work on. Additional improvements include being able to buy items in bulk with discounts, better balancing when it comes to level ups, better encounter rates, a smoother difficulty curve. Battles are now less text-based with damage appearing on the enemy, which is not necessarily better, but works for Final Fantasy. And while grinding is a reality, especially when you get new jobs, it goes by much faster, and you are actually given items and dungeons of more immediate use. To list a few other details, revival is made easy by waters being in many places, but on the flip side there are only a set amount of Phoenix Downs in the game, and money is generally not an object in this game, so the economy is not challenging. But I'll cut them some slack since they may have wanted you to experiment with jobs, which means purchasing more equipment. The inventory size in most games would be sufficient, but in one where you may want to switch jobs and hold on to certain equipment, it can unfortunately get very tight. This was also the first title to integrate hidden areas in both towns and dungeons, with sometimes having to press on things to make them appear, rewarding the curious and those who wanted to explore. With all that said, let us turn to what Sakaguchi did with the narrative. The opening scroll is pure fantasy, with the music giving that Final Fantasy vibe. Prophecies, an earthquake, 4 boys who fatefully fall into a hole, a sunken crystal that warns of vanishing light. But Sakaguchi should be complimented for his attempt at range. Where the last game was heavily plot-driven and rather bleak, this game is more location-based, with the main plot stringing them together, somewhat like Dragon Quest. The story focuses more on the comedy, adventure, lore, with occasional big emotional beats sewn throughout. The humor defines a lot of the early game. After our onion boys fall into the hole, we get some playful banter before running into monsters. Amano's super serious designs have been turned into much more playful sprites with bright colors, in order to fit this tone. Even as they grow more vicious, they still feel more brightly hued than past games. The people of Kazus are cursed, made transparent or into gingerbread cookie outlines. You decide. After beating the Jinn, Sid joins us, and wow, an airship this early? And we crash. But it's okay, we can make that landing like it's nothing. There's this Desh guy who wooed a girl and then left for the mountains. What's that about? Oh hey, dancers make their first appearance. Piano time. Well, there goes Sid. Anyway, that dragon doesn't bode very well. Wow, dragon babies in a giant nest. Oh, it's that Desh guy. He's an amnesiac apparently. Oh no, it's Mommy Bahamut. Run! Hollywood-style dive off the mountain. It's okay, we're in the land of midgets. Well, when in small people land, do as the small people do. And from here on, we get Cowardly Vikings, a dragon who woke up on the wrong side of the coral reef because a gem that somehow his mind or consciousness or whatever was stolen by a rat. We help some dwarves out by beating a guy who took their horn, then plays a Looney Tunes joke on us, playing the oldest trick in the book to get past the dwarf's barrier to steal the other horn, allowing him to become a glorified lizard. We've got guys who live in gold mansions, we're attacked by Mughals, there are 4 stooges who think they're the heroes of light, and old ladies exercising after 1,000-year slumber. Even the pacing has this kind of fun, bouncy flow to it. A portion of Nobuo Uematsu's soundtrack has a weird, goofy vibe to it. Even the boss theme opens with a playful tune before it gets serious. While not laugh out loud funny, It adds a particularly fun atmosphere. The game's individual local stories usually see a villain who causes a problem for a specific region, and eventually there is a revelation connected to the mysterious Zand who amplify their power. The use of the Dragon Quest location-based style, however, is not used very well in comparison. They lack the atmosphere, the narratives are thin, and the individual NPCs don't make them work. The Djinn turning people into gingerbread and our accompanying of Sarah has a simple NES charm to it, some of it no doubt due to the Queen Isis effect. And it's nice to team up with a princess and the whole gingerbread thing is interesting, but that's about it. In these stories, you find yourself jumping from story beat to story beat, with no real lasting impact. To mention it quickly, the talk mechanic you can use with temporary party followers is certainly an interesting means of interaction. They can give you some world building or gameplay hints. However, there is a limited set of what they could say, and it does sometimes feel like they could have done more with it. While on the subject of interaction, you can hand certain people items with the B button, which is an interesting concept, but it's rarely used, not really bringing out its potential. You spend time with Desh, who is revealed to be a guardian of the Tower of Owen. I do like how Medusa taunts you as you go up the tower, adding story and a dramatic touch to the dungeon. And the idea of Medusa dropping the floating continent out of the sky is a very high concept for its time. But these events are not very well dramatized, so when Desh sacrifices himself and they play Uematsu's sadness theme, you don't really feel much. The story of Hein enslaving a castle, raising a city, and so on doesn't feel like it has much to its story either. You later meet Elia, maiden of the water temple, who helps you restore the water crystal. But she sacrifices herself, the sadness theme plays, and we're supposed to be devastated though we just met her. Probably the game's most complex attempt at story is Salonia. A nation is fighting a civil war because the king said so, though one wonders why they don't just revolt. The 4-section medieval metropolis is visually impressive. But outside of the library, there is not much to see and there is a lot of repeated dialogue, making this city feel more dead than it should. To cover NPCs quickly, people still sound too much like walking hints and manuals. Though the NPCs are not as lazy as the last game, they're still not great. You befriend the banished prince, and in the night the king comes to kill his son, but he instead stabs himself, defying his mind control. You face his attendant Gigames, who is really Garuda, the enemy of the kingdom. Again, very good ideas, but it's just plot point after plot point. Eventually you have to kill your mentors Doga and Une, because apparently that's the only way to finish the key to the final dungeon. Once again, cue sadness theme. It's very much forced tragedy, and like the other moments of sacrifice, it doesn't truly feel like you know these people and it doesn't have the intended impact. The lack of storytelling elements to really dramatize them makes it lack lasting appeal, which is common for many NES titles. The story is certainly more than many early RPGs and may have been advanced for its time, but as someone playing in modern day, these specific stories haven't aged very well. The particular inspiration you're supposed to feel simply isn't there. What I do think works, however, is that this game is where Sakaguchi's use of lore and crazy ideas makes the adventure feel grand. By adventure, I mean going on a long quest, seeking all the things in this world while becoming stronger, which is a part of the DQ formula. And he understands this more than the town location concept. He uses a combination of being self-referential with Final Fantasy ideas while taking real-life lore and remixing them for this universe. Even if the location-based stories were weak, the various lore used was what kept me interested. The game uses the crystals of Final Fantasy I, but their purpose and even the way they act are different. They are more like gods of light in this game. There is an overall sense of mysteriousness within the game, with the earthquake and omen to something larger, setting up the tone quite nicely. The influence of Western fantasy is present with the return of the concept of the chosen warriors of light. But there is a twist, as the history of your world is tied up with a dark world and its dark warriors. There are even 4 MacGuffins in which the point is not themselves but to go on the adventure that surrounds them. Though I admit Sakaguchi falters in this regard, as they fall so much into the background that one forgets about their importance. Your first boss is a djinn which comes from Arabic folklore, and rather than a lamp it is sealed in a ring. Next is the Medusa of Greek mythology. You find the kingdom of Argas eerily empty and yellow. Then you hear and see a strange floating tree in the desert. You have a classical folklore idea in the living forest with its inhabitants. And it all comes together when you learn Argas's chief mage Hein had cursed the elder tree and made it his fortress that wanders the desert, becoming the backdrop for this dungeon. The culmination of that build-up and the visuals for the area makes it feel incredible. We adventure through ideas such as gems that are the minds of water dragons and villages of gnomes. When we reach the main world, we find that it has been sealed, covered in water, and time has stopped for the people, which is grand in scope and ambition, though admittedly rough to navigate gameplay-wise. Guldur, in an unexpected move, smashes the crystal, which is shocking, but it's unfortunately undone by just saying it was fake. What adds to this game is world diversity. The huge increase in sprites allows you to have cities dressed up as those job classes. This gives the world a sense of having diverse cultures and disciplines. It gives the sense that the job system isn't pulling its powers out of nowhere. It means your abilities are rooted in the culture of combat, dress, and way of life people around the world are mastering, making them diegetic. And some of the better NPCs explain the mythology of their culture to really flesh out the world building. Some even make reference to each other's societies, which makes this universe feel like a real place. Of particular note is Fargabad, the town of Dark Knights, where you are essentially engaging in their culture of swordsmanship. Many reoccurring series trademarks began in this game or appear alongside new ones to really make this the first quote-unquote franchise game. Chocobos return, but we are also graced with the debut of Fat Chocobo, who gluttonously preserves our items. You have the Gulgans in a circle as a reference to the sages of Final Fantasy I. In the first game, the floating continent was the showcase, but here it's the beginning revelation with a mix of fantasy and ancient high technology. It is curiously the reverse of Dragon Quest III. And of course, there are Moogles. Also playing into this are the dungeons. A good many are caves differentiated by color, not unlike the past two titles, though clearly more sophisticated in their design. But eventually locations such as the path up the mountain, Nepto Temple, and sewers give a sense of feeling like a real place for a better sense of immersion within the world. Goldor's mansion, ostentatious as it is, has a layout akin to a real manor, rather than arbitrarily feeling like a maze. The aforementioned Heinz Castle and the Tower of Owen with its clockpunk influence really begin to express the nature of the fantasy they represent. The farther you reach in the game, the more visceral these become, but it's the final dungeons that truly stand out with their more unusual designs and more esoteric and ethereal musical pieces. Doga's mansion has the feel of coming to the end of a personal journey. The Cave of Darkness really comes off as this place where only a dark knight may tread. The best of these is Forbidden Land Eureka, with its hidden, fantastical atmosphere. In terms of dungeons as special places in the world, using aesthetics to come to life, I actually think Final Fantasy III has some of the best in the series. And if I may mention the design work, the dungeon curve is improved compared to the last game. Rather than throwing in what felt like final dungeon style areas halfway in, the early ones begin simple with small branches and grow more complex with time. In fact, this game may have the opposite problem of two, as they almost take too much time becoming complex. Certain gimmicks come up from time to time, such as becoming a frog to enter a dungeon, but more noteworthy are the ones that see you having to shrink. This means you'll have to put everyone in the back row to offset these stat deficiencies while small, and turn everyone into mages. Some have been annoyed by this concept, but honestly I've come to enjoy these dungeons, when the dungeons do finally become complex. While the increase in length has been gradual, the sudden jump in maze-like complexity is rather large, and it begins with the Cave of Darkness, which has the splitting gimmick. Even if you've figured out the solutions to dealing with the cave, the dungeon length for this particular gimmick overstays its welcome and it becomes a bit of a strain. But all the dungeons after are an enjoyable level of complexity. In general, the game feels well paced, between the right amount of downtime and the time spent within the dungeons. This was the first game to have summons, and aside from Chocobo, they are all derived from different folklore but are completely transformed under Sakaguchi's pen. Shiva becomes the Ice Queen. Ifrit would remain an identity similar to his Fire Djinn origins. The Titans of Greek mythology come in the form of an earth-powered titan. Ramu, most likely based off of Lamu of the Akkadian myths, is reimagined as an old man of lightning. The Asgardian god and King Odin becomes the one-hit kill sword-wielding horseman here. Leviathan, the water beast of the Hebrew Bible, changes role in each game, becoming a summon here. Bahamut, changing roles in each game, becomes a summon here for the first time. This also ties into the series' first optional dungeons, as Doga sealed away Leviathan and Bahamut. You can see these places from afar, but you cannot reach them. But now you are stronger, more powerful, and ready to face them. A gameplay and visual means of showing how far you've come. The eclectic collection of how Sakaguchi uses real-life mythologies, as well as his own original concepts, come together for the first time, as so much of what makes Final Fantasy be Final Fantasy was established here. Add to all of this Uematsu's OST, which gives the game a big adventure feeling. This is the game where he really starts to hit his stride and his tunes sound like real, full music. The overworld theme manages to convey a long, lonely, uphill battle with many adventures, feeling as if the wind is beating against you. The boss theme is glorious and powerful. You can truly tell Uematsu had a better understanding of the Famicom's capabilities, of its sound chip, and how to create great music out of it. The central mythology of the game reveals that the ancients attempted to harness and abuse the power of the light crystals, and thus were responsible for the Flood of Light, which would have destroyed the world of light and dark if it weren't for the Dark Warriors. Whereas the hero's ancestor lands are typically portrayed as heroic, like Dragon Quest III, that isn't the case here. The ancient race long ago had disgraced themselves, hence why they had banished themselves to the floating continent. The location is an interesting reversal of the first game, as there it was a late game showcase, but here it turns out to be the beginning area. The remembrance of the past is strong within the village of the ancients, who live upon a raised area reflecting the greater nature of the floating continent. One of the game's highlights is how this revelation is presented early on, with you making your way west and finding you are greeted by nothing but air, displaying the truth with strong visual flair. But presently, the opposite of what occurred long ago is happening, as the dark crystals are now the ones being abused. The lore then surrounds Doga, Une, and Zand, who were students of Noah, a famous sage, aptly named after the biblical figure, as this is a game about the floods of light and darkness. These students had helped stop the flood of light. Afterwards, Noah granted Doga vast power, granted Une dominion of the dream world, and to Zand he granted mortality. You must go underwater, which is ambitious for a Famicom RPG, though it is underused in the game, with a lack of locations in the underwater map. Beneath the oceans you reach the Temple of Time, to obtain the loot to bring Une back from the dream world. Une then says you must obtain the great ship Invincible. The game has multiple airships which accomplish different tasks, but it's annoying that you simply cannot upgrade a single ship, or that the final ship cannot accomplish what all the previous ones can. That said, the Invincible is a great idea with an accessible interior, which contains an inn, a fat chocobo, and shops. It is said that only one of Noah's pupils could have caused the current chaos. Zand, angry, is attempting to make darkness his power. Noah's gift to Zand as a normal human was the best, but he did not understand. He could have walked the world, sharing what he knew and had with others. The ways of Noah could have been known to everyone, but he wanted power too much. He has given into desires born of that power, and like Saruman of many colors of Lord of the Rings, he has entered into a station above what he was meant for. This is a major theme of Final Fantasy III, overabundance and overflow of power. In the past it was the flood of light, now it is the flood of darkness. Each villain in the game receives an overabundance of power from Zan they were never meant to have. Each person accepted something beyond their means, and as a result, they require an equal and opposite force to come in and restore the balance. Doga searches for the 5 hearts, who turn out to be the friends you've made along the way, making this the first game to use the trope of everyone you met helping you. And finally, you encounter Zand, but he turns out to be a pushover because, surprise, he's not the final boss, setting a precedent for many Final Fantasy titles. The Cloud of Darkness has arrived to return all to Void, vanquishing light and dark. In a very fascinating development, you must go to the Dark World with its dark crystals and dark warriors who help you face 4 bosses. Some also based on mythological lore remixed into Final Fantasy staples. All of this culminates with your battle with the Cloud of Darkness, making Final Fantasy III perhaps the earliest game to feature a large, metaphysical, symbolic enemy on a cosmic scale because events have beckoned them to consume everything. When any one power grows too large, it brings on this apocalyptic creature, symbolically saying that when anyone gains too much power, they are inviting the destruction of themselves as well as the world around them, for that power cannot so easily be controlled. We receive the origin of this universe, of life, the light and dark, and the hope that shall divide them again. One power is prevented from overpowering another. Both are restrained within their proper domain, and the order upon which this world was founded upon is maintained. Light and dark in this game represent less of good and evil, and more of 2 divergent powers, while the void represents complete destruction. Too much power upsets the balance. There must be a separation, each in its own place, its own dominion, and not one to overpower the other. The void, which represents the destruction resulting from the conflict between the two, is the true evil within this game's world. Final Fantasy III is ultimately about the natural order of things and perhaps even natural order philosophy. It is about the proper place and function of all things, how conflict results from those who choose disorder, and counterbalancing the rise of disorder, and that in the face of those conflicts, it is important to have hope to resist the chaos that could consume everything. All of this is perhaps thin and not fully explored, much like the town stories, but it serves as an early attempt at something grand, and future games like Twilight Princess would use these ideas. Moving on to subsequent releases, the original game was never released in the West. Box art sketches were circulated, but after plans to release Final Fantasy II fell through, due to the SNES being on the horizon, the 2 games were skipped over. While annoying, from a business perspective, this was perhaps the right thing to do at the time. In Japan, Final Fantasy III would be ported to the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS virtual consoles, whereas the Western NES Classic had the first Final Fantasy. The Nintendo Classic Mini Family Computer had this game instead. It was meant to have a WonderSwan Color remake like 1, 2, and 4. It was never formally cancelled, but it was never completed. Square, in conjunction with Matrix Software, created a 3D remake for the Nintendo DS. Because the game makes quite a few changes, I will create a video to cover it in detail. The remake is faithful to the original in many ways. However, they did make modifications to the job system. They replaced the spiritual capacity system with a job adjustment phase, which reduces your stats until a certain number of battles have passed. The characters also begin the game as freelancers to reflect later job systems. The best changes come in the form of fixing certain jobs such as the Geomancer and Scholar, making them more usable. Certain jobs have been granted an additional ability, which is great. However, some of the revisions in attempting to balance the jobs went too far, with the effect of making many less useful, and overall disrupting the concept of the Master Class system. They also moved some jobs around, perhaps to give you more options more quickly. One interesting idea is that later in the game you can meet the legendary Smith, and for attaining skill level 99 in any job, you will gain a master item associated with that class. A bonus dungeon has been added to the game, as well as a super boss. They have also increased the difficulty, but not in a way that's truly interesting. Rather than making it a more strategic challenge, They simply made bosses hit harder, allowing them to one-shot you, simply forcing you to grind more. And even by 1/3 into the game, this supposed difficulty fades away. The mostly silent protagonists are replaced by named characters. The idea is fine in concept, but I do feel that each character was merely a walking trope. Thus, the game neither has the metaphor of the original, nor fully formed intriguing characters, attaining only a lukewarm middle. It also doesn't quite capture the comedy of the original, nor does it aim to improve any of the individual location stories. A new addition is Magnet, which allows you to send and receive letters, both to characters within the game and to other owners of Final Fantasy III, either through Wi-Fi or a friend code, though the Wi-Fi servers are now down, so only the latter is available. Some new content is unfortunately locked behind this, such as the hidden overpowered Onion Knight job. The 3D visuals are of the typical DS style, which has become somewhat dated by this point. It's quite faded and doesn't always bring out the fullness of certain locations. The central story has new additions to work the Cloud of Darkness more into the story, but none of it is truly worth mentioning at this point in time. Later, this version would be ported to iOS, Android, PSP and by extension the PSN Store, Kindle Fire, Ouya, Windows Phone, and Steam, with various changes between each. If you wish to play this version of the game and you only have a DS, 3DS, or Steam, despite my complaints, this is a legitimate way of going through the game. However, as you know, with Final Fantasy I, I preferred the PS1 remake, and with Final Fantasy II, any version but the original. But with Final Fantasy III, there is a charm to the Famicom title that the remake doesn't fully capture. The way the visuals, sprites, locations, and music come together has something that the remake is simply missing. Final Fantasy III by the end of the Famicom lifetime would sell 1.4 million copies, making it the first game in the series to break 1 million sold. Among Famicom RPG titles, it's hugely important, perhaps right behind Dragon Quest III and IV. In certain polls in Japan, depending on who's voting, it can sometimes manage to get ranked ahead of 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. The game, while it has aged well, is dated in some ways, and some of its contents are more of a novelty, and some of the love for it is certainly nostalgia-driven. But regardless, we cannot deny its historical importance, and this game was the end of an era. The hit system would be less important going forward, with the ATB system taking prominence. It was the last masterclass game in the series, and it was the last blank slate game not counting spin-offs. It is a satisfying conclusion to Final Fantasy's first age. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I ask that you like and comment to help with the algorithm, and to subscribe for future videos. If you want to support the channel, I have both a Patreon and a Subscribe Star, and all I ask for is $1 a month. Thank you for watching, and God bless you all.